The storm lashed furiously against the windows. At 3 a.m., in Arlington, Virginia, in a stately brick home within the secure residential complex of Fort Belvoir, Eleanor Caldwell felt the first contraction. It was sudden and intense, like an electric shock tearing through her heavy body. Eleanor gritted her teeth, her forehead beaded with cold sweat. She was alone in the final month of her pregnancy. The second contraction came sooner than expected. Eleanor pushed herself up on the edge of the bed, trying to stand, and then a torrent of warm liquid gushed down her thighs. Her water had broken. Panic rose in her throat as her trembling hand reached for the phone on the nightstand. The screen lit up, showing her wedding photo with David Anderson. He, handsome and extraordinary in his lieutenant colonel's dress uniform. She, in an immaculate white wedding gown, smiling sweetly. That night, he had told her he had an unscheduled emergency drill on base. Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC, had critical training exercises. Eleanor dialed her husband's number. Her only comfort at that moment was the sound of his voice. The phone connected quickly, but on the other end of the line, there was no solemn sound of training grounds, no whistle of the wind at the barracks. What she heard was a heavy, lascivious panting and the suggestive, broken moans of a woman in the throes of ecstasy. Eleanor froze, her entire body paralyzed, and the pain of the contractions in her belly seemed to stop for an instant. She heard her husband's familiar voice, the same one she heard daily, but now hoarse with desire. David Anderson's voice echoed in a seductive whisper. "Chloe, you little devil, don't move like that. Chloe," a name unknown to her, which stabbed into Eleanor's heart like a dagger. She didn't hang up. The physical pain returned with brutal force, but Eleanor's mind was as cold as ice. She stared at the phone screen, the call in progress. An idea crossed her mind. Her hand, though shaking violently from the pain, moved with precision across the screen. She activated the call recording feature. In her ears, the symphony of betrayal continued. The moans of the woman named Chloe grew sharper, mixed with gasps and the wet sound of flesh against flesh. Almost a minute that felt like a century, torturing her eardrums and shattering her soul. She bit her lower lip so hard she tasted the metallic tang of blood in her mouth. The call was suddenly disconnected from the other end. He was surely finished. Eleanor took a deep breath. The sharp pain in her womb was nothing compared to the emotional pain that was suffocating her. Calmly, she looked at the audio file that had just been automatically saved. She didn't call David again. She opened her contacts and called the Anderson family's driver. Her voice was dry, but terrifyingly steady. "Frank, my water broke. Come get me now to take me to Walter Reed National Military Medical Center." She hung up without giving the driver a chance to ask questions. Then, Eleanor opened her messaging app, scrolled through her contact list, and stopped at a name saved with the utmost solemnity: Dad. It was 4-star General Harrison Anderson, the commander of Fort Belvoir, her father-in-law. Eleanor's finger decisively pressed on the newly saved audio file and sent it. After the file sent successfully, she typed a short message, each word clear and concise. "Dad, my water broke. I'm on my way to Walter Reed. David is busy. Send." She tossed the phone aside and braced herself for the next contraction, feeling as if her back was about to split in two. That night, either she and her child would die, or all of them would pay the price. The black government sedan sped through the torrential rain. The D.C. area at night was engulfed in the storm. Eleanor sat in the back seat, gripping the seatbelt tightly. Her face was pale, without a single tear, but her gaze was empty, lost on the world outside. The city's neon lights blurred with the rain, just like her 3-year marriage. She and David Anderson had been brought together by a family arrangement. On one side, a prestigious family of Ivy League academics from Boston. Her father was a renowned history professor. On the other, an illustrious military dynasty from Virginia with 3 generations of generals. It was a perfect union, but Eleanor had come to truly love David's excellence. He was the youngest lieutenant colonel in his unit, the pride of the command. In the beginning, he had treated her very well, with respect and courtesy. He wasn't romantic, but he gave her a sense of security. Until 6 months ago, everything began to change. The emergency drills started, the secret work trips. He remained kind, even more attentive, personally preparing her herbal pregnancy teas, but the emotional distance grew each day. With a woman's sensitivity, Eleanor soon realized it, but she had no proof and didn't want to believe it. The child in her womb was the last thread that kept her tied, but that night, David Anderson himself had severed it with his own hands. The car screeched to a halt at the entrance of the military hospital's emergency room. Frank, the driver, rushed out to open her door. Nurses and doctors were already waiting with a gurney. As soon as they placed Eleanor on it, a senior female doctor looked grimly at the monitors. "The situation is critical. The patient is showing signs of distress, and the fetal heart rate is unstable. We have fetal distress. We need to prep her for an emergency C-section. Where is the family member? Who signs the consent form?" Frank, flustered, stammered, "Ma'am, the lieutenant colonel." Eleanor, with a ragged breath, nearly fainting from the pain, extended her trembling hand. "I'll sign." The doctor was surprised for a second, but quickly handed her the clipboard and a pen. Eleanor looked at the words, "Consent for surgical intervention, cesarean section." Alone, she signed her name, Eleanor Caldwell. Just as she let go of the pen, the emergency room doors burst open again. A gust of cold air and an imposing presence filled the room. It wasn't David Anderson. General Harrison Anderson stood in the doorway. He was still in his four-star general's uniform, his stars gleaming under the fluorescent lights. His face, nearing 60, was sharp and severe like a statue, but now it held a suppressed storm. Behind him, his aide and 2 uniformed escorts stood firm at the door. All the doctors and nurses in the room held their breath and saluted in unison. General Anderson ignored everyone. His gaze cut through the crowd and locked onto his daughter-in-law, lying on the gurney. He saw her pale face, her lips bitten raw, and the signature she had just made. His voice was hoarse, trying to contain a monumental rage. "Eleanor, stay calm. Dad is here." Eleanor looked at him. The strength she had tried to maintain from home until that moment seemed about to crumble. She said nothing, only nodded slightly. The head of service immediately gave a signal. "To the oar, now." The gurney was pushed away, and the green doors of the operating room swung shut, separating her from the outside world. Eleanor's mind was still taut as a bowstring, but as the strong smell of disinfectant filled her nostrils, she realized how terrified she was. The hallway outside the operating room was oppressively silent. The white fluorescent light reflected off the general's uniform, making his face even more stoic. The air around him was so dense that even the 2 escorts standing a few feet away held their breath, their backs straight as boards. Harrison Anderson remained motionless, but a storm of fury raged within him. He opened his military-issued phone and listened again to the audio file Eleanor had sent him. The lascivious gasps, the woman's shameless moans, his own son's whispers, hoarse with desire. Every sound was like a needle piercing the pride and honor he had defended his entire life. The rage caused his shoulders, normally steady as mountains, to begin to tremble uncontrollably. This was not just infidelity. It was a humiliation to the Anderson name. It was a grave breach of military discipline, especially at a delicate time when David Anderson was on the promotion list for colonel. A stain like this was enough to destroy his entire career. At that moment, hurried, panting footsteps echoed down the end of the hall. David Anderson came running. He was still in his lieutenant colonel's uniform, but the collar, which should have been impeccable, was disheveled and the fabric hastily wrinkled. On his neck, under the hospital lights, a faint smudge of lipstick was visible. David was breathing heavily, his face pale with worry, but he tried to maintain his composure. "Dad, you're here. How's Eleanor?" "I just finished an urgent combat briefing and rushed over as soon as I heard." Smack! A sharp, resounding crack echoed through the hallway. Harrison Anderson's slap struck his son's cheek with the full force of a general. It was so hard that David's head snapped to the side, and a trickle of blood appeared at the corner of his mouth. The 2 escorts immediately turned to face the white wall, as if they hadn't seen or heard a thing, but their hands clenched behind their backs betrayed their shock. Harrison Anderson roared. His normally imposing voice was now raw with fury, each word a knife. Urgent briefing? You had your briefing in some woman's bed, you disgrace. He didn't give David a chance to react. He threw his own phone at his son's chest. The audio file played on speaker. Right there, in a hospital corridor that should only smell of disinfectant, the obscene raw sound of his sexual encounter echoed stridently. Chloe Vance's moans, David's gasps. Everything was audible in unbearable detail. David Anderson's face went from pale to paper white, then to an ashen gray. He stared at the phone at his feet, trembling from head to toe. The lie he had just told had become a humiliating farce. He looked up at his father and saw in his eyes not just anger, but absolute disappointment and contempt. David's knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the cold tile floor. Just then, click, the red light above the operating room door went off. A few seconds later, the green door opened. A veteran-looking doctor, likely the chief of surgery, came out, wearily removing his mask. He was slightly taken aback by the scene but quickly regained his professional composure. He approached Harrison Anderson and bowed his head. "General, the operation was a success. Mother and son are stable. It's a boy, 7 pounds, 1 ounce, very healthy." Harrison Anderson nodded slightly. The anger in his face was momentarily contained, replaced by a rare flicker of relief. He asked, his voice still hoarse, "And my daughter-in-law?" The doctor sighed. "The patient lost a significant amount of blood. Additionally, she suffered a severe emotional shock before delivery, so her body is very weak. She will need to be in intensive observation for the next 24 hours. The family should be prepared." The doctor's last sentence was like a bucket of cold water on the budding relief. Harrison Anderson clenched his fists. His gaze, cold as ice, swept over his son kneeling on the floor once more. "This is all your fault." Eleanor Caldwell awoke in a quiet VIP room. The smell of disinfectant was faint, not as overwhelming as in the emergency room. The weak light of dawn filtered through the blinds, illuminating a small bassinet next to the bed. Inside, a tiny creature with still wrinkled reddish skin slept soundly. Her son. She looked at him, but her gaze was empty, lacking the overflowing joy of a new mother. The C-section incision still ached, but that pain was nothing compared to the wound in her heart. Click. The door opened softly. David Anderson entered. He had changed into clean civilian clothes, but the dark circles under his eyes and the look of exhaustion and remorse were evident. The mark from his father's hand was still visible on his cheek. He approached the bed cautiously, looking at her with a complex expression. "Eleanor, you're awake? How are you feeling?" He tried to take her hand, which was resting on the blanket. "Eleanor, let me explain. Things are not what you think. Eleanor shifted slightly, withdrawing her hand with a gentle but firm gesture, leaving his hand suspended in the air. Her gaze slowly moved from the baby to his face, a gaze so serene it was frightening, without a trace of emotion, as if she were looking at a complete stranger. "Lieutenant Colonel Anderson, you should take a shower first," she said. Her voice was weak after the surgery, but each word was clear and frigid. "The smell of that woman's perfume on you is too strong. Our son is just a newborn. His respiratory system is delicate. He can't be around foreign fragrances." David was speechless. Lieutenant Colonel Anderson. That's what she called him. Not David, not honey. That distant, ironic form of address was like an invisible wall of ice rising between them. He realized, horrified, the change in Eleanor. She didn't scream, she didn't question him, she didn't insult him. There was only an absolute coldness, a coldness more terrifying than any storm. It meant her heart was dead. At that moment, the door opened again. Harrison Anderson entered, followed by his aide. The general had changed out of his uniform into simpler clothes, but his imposing aura had not diminished. He looked at his son with eyes as sharp as knives. "Return to the base immediately. Write a detailed report on your conduct last night. From now until further notice, you are under full arrest in your quarters. You are not to take a single step outside. Hand over your phone." His voice wasn't loud, but each command was non-negotiable. David dared not argue. He knew he had caused a monumental disaster. He bowed his head, silently took his phone from his pocket, and handed it to his father's aide with both hands. Then he looked at Eleanor with helplessness and left the room, his head hung low. The door closed. Only Eleanor and her father-in-law remained in the room. Harrison Anderson approached the bed, his voice much softer. "Rest, daughter. Don't think too much. I assure you, I will give you a satisfactory resolution to all of this." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes dry, tearless. She nodded slightly, then turned her gaze back to the window. A satisfactory resolution. She wondered if for a broken marriage and a dead heart, there could ever be any resolution that would fix everything. In a luxury apartment in the heart of the city, Chloe Vance was calmly applying a face mask. The scent of lavender filled the air. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still gray. This was the apartment David Anderson had secretly bought for her with his own money. Everything in the home had been her choice. From the cream-colored Italian leather sofa to the soft wool rug under her feet, she had just received a message from a nurse friend at the military hospital. Eleanor Caldwell has given birth. A boy. Emergency C-section. The general came in person. Chloe's lips, covered by the mask, curved into a smile. She felt not the slightest bit of panic. On the contrary, a sense of triumph filled her chest. She knew David would have been called to account and was probably facing his father's wrath. So what? It was all part of her plan. Last night, when David's phone rang while they were in the middle of their act, she had seen the name Eleanor on the screen. It was she who had deliberately moaned louder, using the most provocative sounds to torture the woman on the other end of the line. She wanted Eleanor Caldwell to know. She wanted to deliver this fatal blow to the woman she considered weak, always hiding behind the shell of a refined intellectual. Chloe's target had never been just David Anderson. He was brilliant, handsome, a general's son, but he was just a stepping stone. What she really wanted was the title of Mrs. Anderson, with all the prestige and power that came with it. She had thoroughly researched Eleanor Caldwell, a woman too rational, too calm, who lived a life that was too secure. That type of woman would completely fall apart with a single, strong enough blow. Last night's moans were that blow. She removed the mask and admired her pure, innocent face in the mirror. That appearance was her most powerful weapon. It drove men crazy and made women let down their guard. She patted her cheeks, her eyes gleaming with calculation. Now it was time for Plan B. She opened her phone and went to her private Instagram account, which she only used to contact a few close friends. She selected a photo she had taken the week before. It was an artistic shot. Only a corner of military green bedsheets was visible, and her slender hand gripping the wrist of a uniform sleeve. The man's face didn't appear, but anyone could guess who it was. She wrote a short, suggestive caption, "Not even the storm scares me when I'm with you." After posting it, she made sure the account was set to private, allowing only a few people on her list to see it. Among them was the wife of an officer in the Cultural Affairs Corps, a woman famous for being a gossip with good connections to the wives of senior officials in D.C. She knew that in less than a day, that photo and message would reach the eyes of the person who most needed to see them. Beatrice Anderson, David Anderson's mother. Chloe had studied everything. Beatrice was a woman of weak character who lived in Boston, always feeling guilty for not being able to be close enough to take care of her son. She was also not entirely satisfied with a daughter-in-law as rational as Eleanor Caldwell. A mother like that was the weak point of that family. If Beatrice intervened, no matter how strict Harrison Anderson was, he would have to yield to his wife. At that point, Eleanor Caldwell, who had just been through a life-or-death experience and was now facing pressure from her mother-in-law, would surely not be able to bear it and would surrender. Chloe smiled with satisfaction and set her phone aside. She was certain that the day she would enter the Anderson house as the new Mrs. Anderson was not far off. The prey had fallen into the trap. All that was left was to slowly tighten the noose. 5 days in the hospital felt like a century. Eleanor Caldwell's recovery was slow. The C-section wound still hurt, and her body was so weak she barely produced any milk for her son. Little Harrison, her son, had to be fed mostly with formula. She watched the baby in silence, unable to describe her feelings. There was love, but also a vague distance. This child had been born on a night of storm and betrayal. He was her blood, but also the testament to the failure of her marriage. On the second day, her mother, Dr. Helen Caldwell, flew in from Boston. She was a brilliant historian, an intelligent and insightful woman. She didn't cry or bombard her with questions. She simply stayed by her side, helping her care for Harrison and preparing nutritious meals. But Eleanor knew her mother understood everything. On the third night, when only the two of them were left in the room, Dr. Caldwell gently placed her hand on hers. "What happened? Tell Mom." Eleanor looked at her mother, and the fortress she had built over the past few days suddenly crumbled. She didn't cry, but her voice trembled. She told her everything. The 3 a.m. call, the other woman's moans, David Anderson's coldness. When she finished, her mother's face hardened, anger flashing in her normally serene eyes. But she didn't curse the Anderson family. She just squeezed her daughter's hand tighter. "Helen Caldwell's daughter will not suffer such humiliation. Whatever you do, Mom will support you." That sentence gave Eleanor the strength she needed. On the day Eleanor was to be discharged, Harrison Anderson came to see her. In the few days they hadn't seen each other, he seemed to have aged visibly. His hair seemed to have more gray. He came alone, without an aide or escorts. He sat in the chair next to the bed, looked at Eleanor, and then at his grandson sleeping in the bassinet. His voice sounded tired. "David has been indefinitely suspended from his duties and is under investigation by the discipline unit. That ballerina has also been suspended from the ballet company. I will handle this rigorously, without covering up for anyone." He paused, as if choosing his words. "I know you have suffered greatly. I will give you a satisfactory resolution." Eleanor listened in silence, not interrupting. When he finished, she spoke, her voice still weak but incredibly clear. "Dad, thank you for protecting my dignity these past few days." Harrison Anderson nodded slightly, thinking she understood that everything would be resolved quietly to preserve the family's honor. But Eleanor's next sentence stunned him. "But I want a divorce." 3 short words, spoken from her dry lips, but with the weight of a ton, struck the general's mind. Harrison Anderson could hardly believe what he was hearing. He looked at his daughter-in-law, whom he had always considered docile and reasonable. He never imagined she could be so decisive and ruthless. "Eleanor, have you thought this through?" His voice sounded a bit bewildered. "Harrison was just born. Aren't you thinking of him? Besides, the honor of the Anderson family." "If this gets out," Eleanor interrupted him gently. For the first time, she looked him directly in the eyes, without fear or hesitation. "David Anderson threw away the honor of the Anderson family. Not me. That night, while he was busy in another woman's bed as I fought for my life, that honor no longer existed." She took a deep breath, her hand unconsciously clutching the blanket. "I cannot live with a man who betrayed me at the most sacred and dangerous moment of my life. Dad, I'm sorry, but this is my final decision." On the day of her discharge, Eleanor Caldwell did not allow the Anderson family to arrange any ceremony. She simply put on a comfortable cotton outfit, her face still pale, and held little Harrison in her arms, wrapped snugly in a soft blanket. Her mother, Dr. Caldwell, carried a small bag beside her. Frank, the driver, was already waiting at the door. He respectfully opened the car door to help Eleanor. "Ma'am, shall we go to the house?" Eleanor shook her head, her voice calm. "No, Frank. Take us to the Vista Bella luxury apartments on K Street." Frank froze, a look of confusion on his face. He glanced at Dr. Caldwell for confirmation. Her mother simply nodded firmly. He didn't dare ask more questions. He closed the door silently and started the car. The black government sedan did not turn towards the familiar military complex, but merged into the dense city traffic. Eleanor watched the scenery pass by the window, her heart as calm as a lake after a storm. She had thought a lot about this decision over the past 5 days. That house, which was once her home, now every corner reminded her of the betrayal. She couldn't breathe that air anymore. Harrison Anderson did not stop her. When Frank informed him, he remained silent in his office for a long time and then waved his hand. Let her go. He knew that with Eleanor's character, forcing her at that moment would only make things worse. But he did not abandon her completely. A silent order was issued. 2 of his best plainclothes escorts would take turns protecting the safety of Eleanor and her son from a distance, 24/7. After all, they were still the daughter-in-law and grandson of the commander of Fort Belvoir. The serviced apartment that Dr. Caldwell had rented was on the 28th floor, with a view of the entire city. It wasn't as opulent as the Andersons' house, but it was clean, modern, and most importantly, it didn't belong to the Anderson family. It was a safe space, a new beginning. When the door closed, separating them from the outside world, Eleanor felt she could finally breathe. She placed Harrison in the small bed they had prepared, watching her son sleep. A feeling of heavy responsibility, but also of sweet fulfillment, washed over her. From now on, she was no longer living just for herself. That night, after putting Harrison to bed, Eleanor was exhausted and about to fall asleep when her phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. She hesitated for a moment but answered. On the other end of the line, there were a few seconds of silence, and then a familiar voice, tense with anger, resonated. "Have you made enough of a scene yet?" It was David Anderson. He was under arrest and without a phone, but he had found a way to get another one to call her. Eleanor said nothing, just listened silently. Her silence seemed to enrage him further. David's voice grew harsher. "I asked if you've made enough of a scene. Leaving the house. Do you know what everyone on base is gossiping about? Come home right now. Do you want the entire command to laugh at me?" At that moment, Eleanor let out a soft laugh, a light but sarcastic laugh. That laugh was like throwing gasoline on a fire. David yelled through the phone, "Eleanor Caldwell, what are you laughing at? Don't think that just because my father is backing you, you can do whatever you want." Eleanor slowly sat up. Her voice was as cold as glacial ice. "David Anderson," she called him by his full name. "You should be worried about your position as a lieutenant colonel before you worry about your pride. I think a lieutenant colonel from JSOC lying to his superiors to sleep with a ballerina on the night his wife gives birth is far more ridiculous than his wife and son moving out." She paused and continued, each word a knife. "Oh, and by the way, my lawyer will be sending the divorce papers to your unit soon." With that, she hung up abruptly, giving him no chance to say anything else. It was the first time she had stood up to him with such a firm attitude. In the silent room, only the quiet breathing of little Harrison could be heard. Eleanor looked at her son, clenching her fist. The war had just begun. The news that Eleanor Caldwell had left home with her son and filed for divorce, coupled with David Anderson's suspension, could no longer be contained. Like a wildfire, the news flew from D.C. to Boston, reaching the ears of Beatrice Anderson. The next day, David Anderson's mother took the first flight to D.C. She was a woman who had been pampered since childhood and then protected by her husband. In her 50s, she still looked young and elegant, but her eyes lacked sharpness and experience. The first thing she did upon arriving in D.C. was not to go to the hospital to see her daughter-in-law and grandson, nor to the apartment to check on them, but to use her old contacts to go directly to the unit where David was under arrest. In the austere arrest room, Beatrice saw her only son, haggard and with several days' growth of beard, and tears immediately welled up. She embraced her son, gently patting his back as she cried, my boy, how could you be so foolish?" She cried and cursed Chloe Vance, calling her a home-wrecking tramp. But after cursing her, she turned to her son, her voice full of reproach, not because he had been unfaithful, but because he had let it all come to light. "You can have your fun on the side, I don't care. What man doesn't have his moments? But how could you let that Eleanor find out? Now look at this mess. Your father is furious, and she's even asking for a divorce. You have to convince your wife to come back. The Caldwell family is not just anybody. If this gets any bigger, you'll be the only one who gets hurt." After lecturing her son, Beatrice Anderson remembered her main mission. She got Eleanor's new phone number and called her immediately. Eleanor was feeding Harrison a bottle when she received the call. Seeing mother-in-law on the screen, she frowned but answered, "Hello?" On the other end, Beatrice's voice was sweet and concerned, very different from the angry tone she had used with her son. "Eleanor, darling, it's me, Mom. How are you and the baby? I've been so worried these past few days. As soon as I could arrange my affairs, I flew down to see you." Eleanor replied calmly, "Thank you for your concern, Beatrice. We are fine. Beatrice got straight to the point, with a tone that was both persuasive and slightly reproachful. "Eleanor, I heard you and David had a little misunderstanding. I know David was wrong, he failed you, but look, all men make mistakes, they have a little fun. You are the wife, the one who holds the family together. You have to be a little more understanding. Harrison is so little, he can't grow up without a complete family, can he?" She spoke non-stop, using all the arguments wives usually hear when their husbands are unfaithful. Eleanor listened in silence, not interrupting. Her silence made Beatrice think she was softening. She continued, "Listen to Mom. Come home. You'll sort it out behind closed doors. When you come back, I'll make him kneel and beg for your forgiveness. What's past is past, okay, dear?" It was then that Eleanor spoke slowly. Her voice contained no resentment, only a weary and icy determination. "Ma'am, my indulgence ran out the night I gave birth." With that, and without waiting for a response, she hung up. Beatrice's arguments might be valid for many, but not for Eleanor Caldwell. Indulgence does not apply to someone who cruelly abandons his wife while she is fighting between life and death. Life in the luxury apartment began to normalize. Under her mother's care, Eleanor Caldwell's health improved day by day. She started producing milk, and though it wasn't much, she insisted on breastfeeding Harrison. Every time she saw her little son latch onto her breast, a sacred and powerful bond formed, soothing the wounds in her heart. She no longer had time to wallow in pain. She had to be strong for her son. One afternoon, after Harrison fell asleep, Eleanor began to organize the few things she had brought from the house, mostly baby clothes and some personal documents. As she reviewed her prenatal checkup records, the numbers and ultrasounds appeared before her eyes. She wasn't looking at them for nostalgia, but searching for something, an anomaly she might have overlooked. And then she stopped. Her mind went back to the last 6 months. Since she became pregnant, David Anderson had become strangely attentive and considerate, especially with preparing her herbal pregnancy teas. Every day, no matter how busy he would personally prepare an herbal infusion for her, saying he had found the best herbalist in D.C. who had prescribed a special formula for her, very nutritious and good for mother and child. At the time, she had been very moved, thinking he had changed for the baby, that he cared more for her. She obediently drank every bitter cup, believing it was her husband's love. But now, remembering it, a chill ran down her spine. She remembered how her body felt in the last months of pregnancy, always tired, listless, very sleepy. The doctor said it was normal during pregnancy, and she believed him. But that fatigue seemed excessive, to the point that sometimes she just wanted to stay in bed with no energy to do anything. Was it just because of the pregnancy, or also because of the effect of those infusions? David's false kindness now appeared in her mind as a disgusting play. Another suspicion arose. His lie on the night of the delivery. Emergency drill. Eleanor had a good friend from college named Sarah. Sarah's husband, Bryce, was a major directly under David Anderson at JSOC. Eleanor opened her messaging app and found her chat with Sarah. She hesitated for a moment, then typed a message, trying to sound natural. "Sarah, have your husband's units been really busy lately? Always with these emergency drills. Last Thursday night, did your husband have to stay on base?" The message was sent. Eleanor's heart pounded. She didn't know what response to expect. Less than a minute later, Sarah replied, "Emergency drill? Not at all. Last Thursday night was super quiet. My husband even stayed home and binge-watched a whole series with me. Are you sure you don't have the day wrong?" The hand holding the phone trembled. There was no drill. He had lied to her. It wasn't a military mission. It was a pre-planned rendezvous. A rendezvous in bed with another woman while his wife was about to give birth. This blatant lie, combined with the memory of the infusions she had been drinking for 6 months, suddenly planted a terrifying thought in her mind, a thought so horrible she had to shake her head, trying to push it away. It can't be. He may not love me, he may betray me, but Harrison is his son. A tiger doesn't eat its own cubs. It can't be. But the seed of doubt, once planted, takes root and grows quickly in the soil of betrayal. It was cold and sharp, digging deep into her heart. This was not just infidelity. Behind it all, there must be a much more terrifying conspiracy. Chloe Vance was not one to sit idly by. Suspended from the ballet company, with all her performances canceled, she was completely isolated. She couldn't contact David Anderson in any way. She felt restless, as if sitting on hot coals. She decided she had to act, to make a bold move. She went to the Vista Bella apartment complex. Eleanor had just put Harrison to sleep when the doorbell rang. Through the video intercom, she saw a face familiar from the photos she had secretly searched for. Chloe Vance. What was she doing here? Eleanor frowned. She didn't want to see her, but she knew that avoiding her was not the solution. This was an opportunity to probe her opponent. She opened the door. Chloe stood outside, completely different from how she had imagined. No makeup, wearing a simple white cotton dress, she looked pale and frail. As soon as she saw Eleanor, her eyes reddened. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said in a choked voice, and suddenly dropped down, trying to kneel. Eleanor stepped back instinctively and said coldly, "Get up and speak on your feet. The floor is very clean. I don't want you to dirty it." Chloe's gesture froze. She looked up, her tear-filled eyes looking incredibly pitiful. She stood up, her voice trembling. "Mrs. Caldwell, I'm sorry. I know I was wrong. David and I truly love each other. I didn't want to destroy your family. I tried to control my feelings, but I couldn't. A perfect performance of a helpless victim, a victim of love." Perhaps someone else would have softened, but Eleanor just looked at her calmly. Her gaze was so penetrating it seemed to see through her soul. She didn't get angry. She didn't scream. She just asked a light question with the weight of a ton. "Do you love him, or do you love the position of a general's son's wife?" This direct question was like a bucket of cold water for Chloe Vance. Her pitiful expression froze for an instant, and the tears stopped falling. She hadn't expected Eleanor Caldwell to be so direct and cutting. Her victim role suddenly crumbled. Chloe knew she could no longer pretend. She hastily wiped her tears, her smile now tinged with mockery. "So what? Whether I love him or his position, the person he chooses now is me." Seeing that Eleanor didn't react, she grew bolder, her tone becoming provocative. "Do you think you can hold on to him? Do you know what David told me? He said being with you is as suffocating as being with the general. You always have to live up to expectations, always so proper. He said you're like a log in bed, without any grace." She deliberately used the most humiliating words to attack Eleanor's pride. She wanted to see her break down, jealous, out of control. But Eleanor remained impassive. Those words could no longer hurt her. She had already been through the worst pain. Compared to the betrayal on the night of the delivery, these insults were like the wind. Her mind now had only one doubt. She gave a cold smile, a smile that unsettled Chloe Vance. Yes, and yet this log still managed to give him a son to carry on the Anderson lineage. Eleanor took a step forward, leaned close to Chloe's ear, and lowered her voice just enough for the two of them to hear. "And you, Miss Vance, the ballerina. I heard you've had 3 abortions, right? The doctor said your uterus is too damaged. I'm afraid it will be difficult for you to have children in the future." Chloe Vance's face turned waxen pale. The abortions were her biggest secret. Only her closest confidants knew. How could Eleanor Caldwell possibly know? Eleanor looked directly into her eyes, seeing the panic and anger in them. She knew she had hit a nerve. A woman who wanted to enter a powerful family, but couldn't have children, was nothing more than an ornament that would sooner or later be discarded. Chloe stammered, You're lying." She couldn't maintain her composure. She turned and fled like a defeated loser. Eleanor closed the door, leaning against the cold wood. This encounter, though brief, had reinforced her suspicions. The desperation and malice in Chloe's eyes could not be hidden. This was not a simple love triangle, it was a game of life and death. And that infusion was a key piece. She had to find proof. The panic in Chloe Vance's eyes as she fled was the final push Eleanor Caldwell needed. She couldn't wait any longer. She had to uncover the truth herself. The next day, she called the driver, Frank, on the pretext that she had forgotten some important baby items and personal documents at the house and needed to go back for them immediately. The official car pulled up once more in front of the familiar gate of the house. Dory, the Anderson family's lifelong housekeeper, hurried out to greet her, her face full of concern. "Ma'am, you're back, and the little one." Eleanor smiled slightly, a perfect, seamless smile. "Harrison is sleeping. My mother is watching him. I just came to get a few things, and I'll be right out." She entered the house. Everything was the same as when she left, but the atmosphere felt cold and strange. She didn't go up to the bedroom, but went straight to the kitchen. "Dory, could you get me a glass of warm water, please? I'm a bit thirsty." While Dory was busy in the kitchen, Eleanor went to the small backyard where there was a compost bin for organic waste. David Anderson had always prided himself on his healthy lifestyle. He said the dregs from the herbal infusions should be put in the garden as fertilizer for the plants. Eleanor's heart pounded. Carefully, she lifted the lid of the compost bin. A smell of dampness and medicinal herbs hit her. Inside, mixed with fruit peels and tea grounds, was a pile of dark brown herb dregs, not yet fully decomposed. That was it. She quickly took out a plastic bag she had prepared in her purse. She used a small stick to scoop a sufficient amount of the dregs, tied it tightly, and hid it at the bottom of her purse. Just then, Dory came out with a glass of water. "Ma'am, were you looking for something out here?" Eleanor turned around with a calm expression. "Nothing, just looking at the orchids my father-in-law planted." She took the glass, took a sip, and went back inside. She went up to the bathroom and pretended to look in the mirror. With lightning speed, she pulled out a few strands of her hair, carefully wrapped them in a tissue, and put them in another compartment of her purse. After grabbing a few unimportant items of Harrison's clothing to cover her tracks, Eleanor left quickly. Back in the car, the back of her shirt was soaked with cold sweat. The next step was to find a reliable laboratory. She couldn't go to any public hospital, much less the military hospital. The Anderson family's network was too extensive. Any move could be detected. She thought of her father. Her father was a scholarly professor with many contacts in the academic world. She called him in Boston. "Dad, do you know anyone who works in an independent research institute specializing in chemical or pharmaceutical component analysis? A friend of mine needs help with a personal matter. It has to be absolutely confidential." Professor Caldwell didn't ask many questions. He was silent for a few seconds, then gave her the phone number of a doctor, a former student of his, who was now a lab chief at a major private analysis center in Boston. That same afternoon, Eleanor drove to a courier office and sent the 2 samples to Boston by express service, requesting absolute confidentiality of the sender. The following days were an agony of waiting. She cared for Harrison while constantly checking her phone, her heart in her throat. 3 days later, an email arrived in her personal account. The subject was "Results of Sample Analysis." Eleanor took a deep breath. Her trembling hand clicked to open the attachment. A detailed report with complex chemical and pharmacological terminology appeared. She skimmed it all, going straight to the conclusion. Analysis of plant matter sample A1 reveals the presence of components from several medicinal herbs commonly used for pregnancy, such as Angelica sinensis, Rehmannia, and Paeonia. However, the presence of 2 active compounds, Z-ligustolide and crocin, is detected in anomalous concentrations. These compounds correspond to 2 plants, safflower, Carthamus tinctorius, and lovage, ligusticum. The analysis of hair sample B1 also shows a long-term accumulation of similar compounds. Special note: safflower is a medicinal plant with blood, activating and stasis, dispelling effects, the use of which is strictly prohibited in pregnant women due to the high risk of inducing uterine contractions, which can lead to threatened miscarriage or spontaneous abortion. The use of small doses over a prolonged period, while not causing an immediate abortion, weakens the health of the mother and the development of the fetus, potentially leading to serious complications during childbirth, especially the risk of postpartum hemorrhage. Postpartum hemorrhage. Those words echoed in her head like a hammer blow. She remembered the doctor's words after the C-section. The patient lost a significant amount of blood. She needs to be closely monitored. Her whole body began to tremble violently. The tablet she was holding fell onto the soft carpet. This was not infidelity, not a simple betrayal. It was an attempted murder, a murder plot disguised as care and attention. Every day, she herself had drunk the poison her husband gave her, smiling and thanking him for his kindness. Eleanor suddenly remembered the information she had discovered. Before joining the ballet company, Chloe Vance had worked briefly as an assistant in a natural medicine clinic. A wave of nausea rose from her stomach. Disgust and horror enveloped her. David Anderson was not just a traitor, he was a demon in human skin. In the cramped arrest room of the unit, David Anderson paced back and forth like a caged beast. He hadn't seen anyone for days, hadn't used a phone, completely isolated from the outside world. This terrifying silence was worse than his father's shouting. His career, his future, everything hung by a thread. He didn't care if Eleanor divorced him. To be honest, he had been tired of that marriage for a long time. He was terrified of his father's investigation. He feared his other mistakes would be discovered. David collapsed onto the bed, pulling at his hair. How had things come to this? The memory began. He met Chloe Vance at a party at the command. She was the principal dancer in a pale pink silk dress, performing a classical dance. Her beauty was not dazzling like Eleanor's, but a pure, soft beauty that awakened the desire to protect her. Eleanor was too perfect, a professor's daughter with a master's degree in psychology, always proper, always rational. With her, David always felt examined, judged. He felt suffocated, as if he were living under his father's shadow again. But Chloe was different. She admired him, idolized him. Her eyes shone like stars when she looked at him. With her, he felt truly a man, an imposing lieutenant colonel, someone in control. He threw himself into the affair like a moth to a flame. Until one day, about 7 months ago, Chloe met him with swollen eyes. She showed him a pregnancy test with 2 lines. "I'm pregnant, David." David was stunned. He had never thought about the consequences. Chloe, crying, told him she loved him, that she didn't need a title, but the baby was innocent. She wanted him to divorce Eleanor. Divorce. Those 2 words were like a bolt of lightning. David didn't dare. He was afraid of his father. Harrison Anderson would break his legs, take everything away from him if he found out. Seeing his hesitation, Chloe cried even more inconsolably, saying that if he couldn't give her a status, she would raise the child alone and leave DC forever. It was in that moment of confusion, between guilt, desire, and fear, that Chloe whispered a plan in his ear. "I used to work in an herbalist shop. I know some herbs that, when combined, can make a pregnant woman feel weak and tired. Eleanor has never been very strong. If she has a miscarriage, it will be due to her own physical weakness." She looked at him with teary eyes, but with a glint of calculation. At that moment, she'll be devastated. You take the opportunity to ask for a divorce. She won't have the strength to fight. That way, you get free without angering the general, and the baby and I will have a future. David Anderson, in his cowardice and stupidity of wanting everything without paying the price, agreed. He convinced himself he just wanted a way out, that a miscarriage wasn't a big deal. After all, they were young and could have more children. He didn't think at all that Eleanor could be in mortal danger. He believed Chloe when she told him it was just an infusion with some side effects. The memory ended. Now, sitting in that cold room, David felt real fear. He had underestimated Eleanor Caldwell and overestimated his own stupidity. He didn't regret betraying her, he only regretted being caught. Eleanor Caldwell did not call the police. She knew that with this terrifying proof, she could send David Anderson and Chloe Vance to prison immediately, but doing so would bring down the Anderson family. Harrison Anderson, the one person who had supported her in her darkest days, would see his career and lifelong honor destroyed. That was not what she wanted. She didn't want to destroy an entire family, she just wanted justice for herself and her son. She called Harrison Anderson's aide directly. She arranged a meeting with him, not at the house or at the command. The place was a quiet tea house in a back alley of Georgetown, a discreet place far from the Andersons' world of power. The tea house was decorated in a classic style, with a faint scent of sandalwood. Harrison Anderson was already there. He was dressed in civilian clothes, a simple gray linen suit, but his imposing presence had not diminished. He was calmly pouring tea, his movements expert and firm. Seeing Eleanor enter, he looked up, his expression somewhat complex. "You're here, sit." Eleanor nodded slightly and sat across from him. She said nothing, just watched him silently as he poured tea into 2 small cups. The silence was total, broken only by the sound of the water. After placing the cup in front of Eleanor, Harrison Anderson finally spoke, his voice deep and hoarse. "About David. I've already investigated it. The infidelity is undeniable. Don't worry. I will handle it with the utmost severity." He still thought she had summoned him just to talk about the divorce and the betrayal. Eleanor did not drink the tea. She placed her purse on the table and slowly took out a dossier bound in clear plastic. She slid it gently across the polished wooden table towards her father-in-law. "Dad, please look at this first." Harrison Anderson frowned slightly. He took the dossier, his expression still calm. But as he read the first lines of the laboratory report, that calmness began to crack. He read slowly, word for word, line by line. His hand, the same one that had held a weapon and commanded thousands of soldiers, began to tremble almost imperceptibly. The more he read, the worse his expression became, changing from surprise to astonishment and then to a deathly pallor. When he reached the final conclusion about the effects of safflower and the risk of hemorrhage, the teacup in his other hand trembled, spilling a little liquid. This was no longer a family scandal of morality. It was a crime, a planned murder plot that had taken place within the family of the commander of Fort Belvoir, and the victims were his daughter-in-law and his unborn grandson. The career, the honor, the pride he had built his entire life, all seemed to be on the verge of collapse because of the stupid son in whom he had placed so many hopes. He put the report down on the table, but his eyes remained fixed on it. A long time later, he looked up at Eleanor. The general's eyes no longer held their imposing authority, only extreme weariness and pain. Eleanor remained calm, her voice without a single inflection but with a frigid undertone. "Dad, at first, I just wanted a peaceful divorce and custody of Harrison. That was all I wanted." She paused, looking him directly in the eye. "But now, I'm not sure if Harrison and I can leave safely." This sentence, which sounded like a weak plea, was actually a sharp knife that stabbed into Harrison Anderson's greatest fear. It implied that if he couldn't guarantee her safety and justice, this report would not just stay on this table. Harrison Anderson took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. He looked at his daughter-in-law, whom he had once considered docile and easy to manage. She turned out to be the strongest and most rational of them all. "What else do you want?" he finally asked, a question that showed he understood the situation. Eleanor looked at him, her gaze firm. "I want justice, and I want the guilty to pay." She emphasized each word, clear and sharp. "Even if it's Lieutenant Colonel David Anderson, Beatrice Anderson could not stay idle in Boston." After Eleanor hung up on her so abruptly, her anxiety grew. She used all her contacts and finally learned of an explosive piece of news through a close friend of her husband's. David Anderson was not just suspended, he was being investigated for an extremely serious matter. This time, she could not maintain her aristocratic composure. She rushed to Eleanor's apartment like a whirlwind. Ding dong, ding dong. The doorbell rang insistently and frantically. Eleanor's mother opened the door. Seeing Beatrice Anderson with her face contorted with anger, she frowned. "Beatrice, what's wrong? What's the rush?" Beatrice Anderson ignored her, pushed her aside, and entered the house. "Where is Eleanor Caldwell? I want to talk to her." Eleanor, who was with Harrison in the bedroom, heard the commotion. She left the child with the nanny she had just hired and calmly walked out to the living room. "Beatrice, were you looking for me?" Seeing Eleanor, Beatrice Anderson immediately performed the scene she considered most effective. She rushed towards her, fell to her knees, and prostrated herself at her feet, her eyes filled with tears. "Eleanor, I beg you, forgive David this one time." Dr. Caldwell, standing beside her, was stunned. "Beatrice, what are you doing?" "Get up," but Beatrice Anderson ignored her. She clung to the hem of Eleanor's dress, crying inconsolably. "I know he was wrong. He's a disgrace. He failed you. But he's my only son. If anything happens to him, I won't be able to go on living. Think, if he goes to prison, his father will also be affected and lose his post. The Anderson family will completely collapse. How can you have the heart to see the legacy of several generations of the Andersons turn to ashes?" She cried and begged, each word putting the interests of the Anderson family and her son above all else, without any mention of the harm Eleanor had suffered. Eleanor stood there silently, coldly observing the woman kneeling at her feet. She had no intention of helping her up. She waited until she finished crying and then spoke slowly, her voice devoid of emotion. "Beatrice." Just that one word made Beatrice Anderson stop crying and look up at her. "When he brought me that cup of poison every day, did he think that I was his wife? That Harrison in my womb was his own child?" Beatrice Anderson froze. "Poison? What nonsense are you talking about?" Eleanor smiled faintly. "Don't pretend anymore. If it weren't something so serious, you wouldn't need to come all the way from Boston to humiliate yourself by kneeling before me." Seeing that she couldn't move Eleanor with tears, Beatrice Anderson knew the charade was over. She jumped up, wiped her tears, and her pitiful expression vanished, replaced by anger and venom. She changed her tune faster than flipping a page. "Eleanor Caldwell, don't think you're so smart. I've already humbled myself before you, and you haven't budged. So don't blame me for being cruel." She pointed directly at her, her voice sharp and cutting. "You want a divorce? Fine, get a divorce. But forget about getting custody of that child. He's the grandson of the Anderson family. He carries our blood. You're an abandoned woman without a stable job. What right do you have to fight us? We have the best lawyers. I'll make sure you end up with nothing." This blatant threat finally revealed the true face of the mother-in-law who had always pretended to be kind and understanding. In her eyes, both Eleanor and Harrison were just pawns to protect her beloved son and the glory of her family. Eleanor looked at her without any fear. On the contrary, there was a glimmer of pity in her eyes. "Try me." Night fell over D.C. In the spacious office of the house in the military complex, Harrison Anderson sat silently behind his mahogany desk. The warm yellow light from the lamp illuminated a thick file in front of him, but it couldn't dispel the coldness on his face. It was the result of the preliminary investigation he had ordered from his most trusted military intelligence unit. He had thought he was prepared to face the worst of truths, but the truth revealed in that file was more terrifying and corrupt than he could have ever imagined. The proof Eleanor had given him was just the tip of the iceberg. His people had dug into every corner, and what they found was not just infidelity, not just a poisoning plot born of jealousy, but a methodical and cruel trap. The first page was a detailed profile of Chloe Vance. She wasn't just a ballerina. Her father, Howard Vance, was the owner of a private construction company called Vance Construction. This company was trying by all means to win the bid for the construction and renovation of a series of new barracks in the D.C. military district, a very lucrative project worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Chloe Vance's approach to David Anderson had not been a romantic coincidence at a party, but a premeditated plan. The next page made Harrison Anderson's hand clench into a fist. They were bank statements and recordings. They showed that David Anderson, the son he had always been proud of, the brilliant and young lieutenant colonel, was involved in petty acts of corruption. He had used his position to divert old but still functional military material to private construction companies under the guise of scrap. The amount wasn't huge, but it was enough to destroy his career and send him to prison, and Chloe Vance had somehow gotten her hands on all this evidence, but she didn't report him. A smart person never discards an ace up their sleeve. She used it as a noose to slowly tighten around David Anderson's neck, turning him from a thrill-seeking lover into a puppet. It was then that Harrison Anderson understood everything. The terrifying infusion plan did not stem from blind jealousy, but was a calculated move in a much larger game. The true mastermind was Chloe Vance, and David Anderson, in his cowardice and fear of being discovered, had become the most stupid executioner. And then the final detail, the one that made the veteran general shudder. The night Eleanor's water broke, David Anderson had no drill. He already knew that. But he didn't go to Chloe Vance's apartment just for pleasure. According to the testimony of a neighbor interrogated by military intelligence, they heard a loud argument in that apartment early in the evening before everything went quiet. They were arguing about how to get rid of the evidence of corruption. Chloe Vance was probably using it to pressure him, to demand something bigger. And Eleanor's call came at that exact moment. The moans Eleanor heard were not accidental, they were a weapon. Chloe Vance did it on purpose. She knew Eleanor was in her final month of pregnancy, her body weakened by the effect of the herbs for half a year. She wanted to use that extreme psychological shock to provoke Eleanor, hoping the pain would lead to a premature birth, or worse, a fatal hemorrhage on the operating table, a natural death from pregnancy complications. If Eleanor died, Chloe Vance would use the corruption evidence to force David Anderson to marry her, legally becoming Mrs. Anderson. If Eleanor survived, she had the fake pregnancy she had invented to keep David tied to her and slowly force Eleanor into a divorce, a perfect, diabolical plan down to the last detail. Harrison Anderson slammed the file shut. A sharp sound echoed in the silent office. The anger within him had given way to a feeling of disgust and bitter defeat. Had he fathered a monster, or had he raised a fool to be a monster's tool? Harrison Anderson remained motionless in his office for a long time. The darkness outside grew deeper. He felt as if he had aged 10 years in a single night. A lifetime of glory, the pride of his family, all seemed to be crumbling at his feet. He picked up the internal phone, his voice hoarse. "Bring David Anderson to my office." 10 minutes later, the door opened. David Anderson entered, looking much more haggard and anxious than days before. He didn't dare look his father in the eye, just bowed his head. "Dad, you called for me?" Harrison Anderson said nothing, just looked at him in silence. His gaze was cold and distant, not like a father to a son, but like a general to a criminal. That silence was more terrifying than any storm. David began to sweat cold, stammering the speech he had prepared. "Dad, I know I was wrong. I couldn't control myself. It was all that Chloe Vance's fault. She seduced me. She set me up. I was just a fool for a moment." He kept trying to deny it, blaming his mistress, playing the victim. Harrison Anderson smiled, a smile colder than ice. Without a word, he picked up the thick file from the desk and threw it in his son's face. The pages flew, scattering on the floor like autumn leaves copies of bank statements, investigation reports. Everything was exposed before David. "You're not just a fool, you're a coward." Harrison Anderson's voice wasn't loud, but each word was a dagger that stabbed into David's heart. "You don't deserve to be my son, and you certainly don't deserve to wear that uniform." David was stunned. He looked at the papers scattered at his feet. He saw the report on the herb analysis. He saw the proof of corruption he thought was well hidden. In that moment, real panic took hold of him. He wasn't afraid of his father's scolding or the divorce. He was afraid of those papers. They wouldn't just end his career, they could send him to prison for life. His last defense crumbled. David fell to his knees, crawling to his father's feet, crying inconsolably. "Dad, save me. I was wrong. I really know it. It was that bitch who incited me. You're the general. With one word from you, everything will be solved. Please, Dad, save me just this once. I'm your only son." He cried and begged, having completely lost the composure of a military officer. Harrison Anderson looked down at him. In his eyes, there was no compassion, only contempt and infinite disappointment. He sharply pushed his leg away. Then he turned, walked to his desk, and picked up the special red military phone. David stopped crying, looking at his father in horror. He knew what that phone was used for. Harrison Anderson's hand firmly dialed a number. When it connected, he said in a monotone but heavy voice, "Judge Advocate General's Corps." "This is Harrison Anderson." He paused, taking a deep breath as if using his last strength. "I want to report my son, Lieutenant Colonel David Anderson." The news that David Anderson had been officially arrested and charged by the military prosecutor's office, not just disciplined, reached Chloe Vance through a secret channel. The phone fell from her hands, hitting the marble floor with a sharp crack. It had all come crashing down. The wall she thought was David Anderson turned out to be a house of cards. And the one who knocked it down was his own father, Harrison Anderson. She had underestimated the ruthlessness of a general when his honor is trampled and overestimated his paternal love. The unease of the past few days turned into absolute panic. Chloe knew that if David had been arrested, She would be next. Flee. It was the only thought left in her mind. Chloe ran to her bedroom, lifted the rug under the bed, and opened a secret compartment. Inside was cash, some gold bars, and 2 passports with completely different names. She had prepared an escape route but hadn't expected to use it so soon. She threw everything into a small suitcase, her hands trembling as she added clothes and her most expensive jewelry. Her father, Howard Vance, had called her in a panicked voice, telling her to go to the airport immediately. He had arranged a flight abroad for that night. Things had spun out of control. As Chloe was zipping up the suitcase, trembling with fear, there was a deafening crash. The door of the luxury apartment, equipped with the best security locks, was knocked down by a brutal force. A team of military police in combat uniforms, their faces impassive and fully armed, stormed the apartment. They moved with professionalism, securing the room in seconds. Their presence brought a chilling, lethal air that froze the atmosphere of the lavish apartment. Chloe let out a sharp scream. The suitcase fell to the floor, spilling clothes and money. She backed away, her back hitting the cold wall, her beautiful face now pale, without a drop of blood. And then, from behind the camouflaged figures, a familiar silhouette slowly entered. Eleanor Caldwell. She wasn't wearing designer clothes, just a simple white shirt and black pants, but her presence was overwhelming. Her face was serene. Her cold gaze swept over Chloe and the mess on the floor, with no satisfaction, only the air of a final judgment. Seeing Eleanor, the fear in Chloe's eyes turned to rage and disbelief. She screamed, her voice shrill. "How dare you, Eleanor Caldwell? You dare to order my arrest?" Eleanor approached slowly, stopping a few steps from her. She looked directly into her now bloodshot eyes. "You dared to harm my son. I dare to send you to prison." Eleanor's voice wasn't loud, but it was clear and firm, echoing in the silent room. "Chloe Vance, you are under arrest as the suspected mastermind of a crime of aggravated assault and as an accomplice in a corruption case related to Vance Construction." Aggravated assault, corruption, everything had been discovered, leaving no detail unturned. Chloe felt the world spin. She had lost spectacularly, at the hands of the woman she had always despised as a log. 2 military police officers stepped forward without a word, twisted her arms behind her back, and snapped cold handcuffs on her wrists. "No, let me go. You have no right. Dad, save me." Chloe struggled and screamed like a madwoman, her long hair disheveled, her angelic face now disfigured by fear, looking pathetic. Eleanor just watched the scene silently. She said nothing more. When they took Chloe away and she passed by her, Eleanor simply leaned slightly to avoid her hateful glare, as if Chloe wanted to devour her alive. The door closed. The apartment returned to a sepulchral silence, with only Eleanor standing in the middle of the chaos, the failed escape suitcase open on the floor. It was all about to end. The investigation into the case of David Anderson and Chloe Vance proceeded at a dizzying pace. Due to the severity and the involvement of a high-ranking officer, everything was handled internally but with extreme rigor. The evidence was overwhelming. The lab report, the testimonies, the proof of bribery, everything pointed to the 2 culprits. David Anderson and Chloe Vance were held separately, with no possibility of communication. During those days, Eleanor did not appear in public. She stayed in her apartment with her mother, caring for Harrison, as if the storm outside had nothing to do with her. She had left everything in the hands of her lawyer and Harrison Anderson. He had promised her justice, and he was keeping his word. A week after Chloe's arrest, Eleanor's lawyer came to see her. He was accompanied by a middle-aged man in an elegant suit and gold-rimmed glasses, looking very professional. "This is Mr. Serrano, the lawyer representing the defendant, David Anderson. He wants to talk to you about a matter." Eleanor invited them into the living room. Her mother discreetly took Harrison to the bedroom. After some formal greetings, Mr. Serrano got straight to the point. "Mrs. Caldwell, I am here today on behalf of my client, Mr. David Anderson, and also at the request of his family." He slid a folder towards Eleanor. "We know that in this matter, you are the biggest victim. No compensation can repair the damage. However, we hope to find a solution that minimizes the losses for both parties, especially for the future of little Harrison." Eleanor remained silent, looking at the folder. Mr. Serrano continued in a sincere and persuasive tone. "My client is fully aware of his mistake and is deeply remorseful. He is willing to accept any punishment from the law. However, in the civil sphere, we have a proposal. Mr. David Anderson will immediately sign the divorce agreement without any conditions. He will voluntarily and completely relinquish custody of Harrison. All marital assets, including the house, vehicles, and savings, as well as all his personal assets, will be transferred to your name as compensation for material and moral damages." He paused and looked at her directly. "In return, we have only one request, that you withdraw the civil complaint for the crime of aggravated assault. That was the ultimate goal. The criminal case for corruption and violation of military discipline was inevitable. But if Eleanor's civil complaint for the attempted poisoning was added, it would be an extremely serious aggravating factor, demonstrating the defendant's cruel nature. The sentence for David would be much more severe." Eleanor faced a choice. On one hand, revenge to the end, maintaining the complaint so that David Anderson would pay the highest price for his crime. He could spend many more years in prison. On the other, practical benefits and a quick end. If she accepted the offer, she would get her freedom, full custody of her son, and a solid financial foundation to start over without having to fight in court for custody or assets. Did she need to bring him to ruin to satisfy her hatred? Or was a peaceful future for herself and her son more important? Eleanor thought of Harrison. She didn't want her son to grow up with a father with such a heavy conviction, such a big stain on his record. She also thought of Harrison Anderson, the old general who had had to turn his own son over to justice. That act of justice over family was already an immense pain. If she pushed it to the end, wouldn't she be rubbing salt in the wound? He had given her justice. Perhaps she should show him one last gesture of respect. When Mr. Serrano left, her mother came out and asked worriedly, "What are you going to do?" Eleanor looked out the window at the illuminated city. She shook her head. "I don't know, Mom." Dr. Caldwell sat beside her, taking her hand. "Justice comes in many forms, Eleanor. Sometimes the harshest punishment isn't the years in prison, but losing everything you once had. And sometimes the greatest victory isn't seeing your enemy fall, but securing a peaceful future." Her mother's words were like a balm that soothed the hatred and doubt in her heart. She knew what was best for Harrison and for herself. The court-martial was held in a special chamber at the Washington Navy Yard. The atmosphere was solemn, almost suffocating. On the bench, a gray-haired major general presided over the court, flanked by military and civilian judges. The prosecutors and defense attorneys were silent. In the dock, David Anderson and Chloe Vance sat far apart. David, in a blue prison uniform, was haggard. His gaze was lost on the floor. Chloe, in a similar outfit, her hair cut short and her face gaunt, had lost all her former purity. In the front row, Eleanor Caldwell sat silently next to her lawyer. She wore a light beige pantsuit and discreet makeup that hid her fatigue. She looked calm and rational, in stark contrast to the two defendants. Behind her, in the public gallery, were Harrison Anderson and Beatrice Anderson. The general sat with his back straight, his face expressionless, but his eyes were closed behind his glasses, as if he didn't want to witness the scene. Beatrice Anderson sobbed continuously, drying her tears with a handkerchief. The trial began. After the prosecutor read the long indictment with irrefutable evidence, the questioning began. The shameful spectacle of blaming each other unfolded in a raw and cowardly manner. Chloe Vance was the first to be questioned. Crying, she spoke of her love for David Anderson. "I admit I had a relationship with the defendant, David Anderson, but he deceived me. He told me he was unhappy, that he would soon divorce to marry me." Her voice was filled with anguish. "About those infusions, I admit I was the one who gave him the recipe, but it was because David forced me. He told me that if I didn't help him get rid of the baby, he could never get a divorce. He said we just needed her to have a miscarriage to solve everything. I, out of love, out of stupidity, agreed. I didn't know those herbs could be deadly. I'm a victim too." She collapsed onto the table, her shoulders shaking. A perfect performance by someone blinded by love. Then it was David Anderson's turn. He stood up, his voice hoarse and full of rage, pointing at Chloe Vance. "She's lying. It was all her fault." He admitted to the bribery, but told a completely different story about the poisoning plot. "It was she who blackmailed me with the corruption evidence. She said that if I didn't do what she said, she would send everything to the discipline unit. She wanted to get into the Anderson family, to be Mrs. Anderson. The plan to poison Eleanor was her idea. I only did it out of fear, to try to hide my mistake. I never wanted to kill my wife and my son." The questioning became chaotic. They insulted and accused each other, revealing their dirtiest secrets before the court. The love they once proclaimed had turned into ugly hatred. Finally, the presiding judge banged the gavel, calling for order. "Will the witness, Mrs. Eleanor Caldwell, please take the stand?" Eleanor calmly walked to the stand. She did not look at the two defendants. She looked directly at the judge. Her voice was clear and steady. She did not cry. She did not complain about her pain. She simply presented the facts concisely and objectively. The 3 a.m. call, the audio file, the discovery of the herbs, and the analysis process. Her testimony had no superfluous details or personal emotion, but that very calmness was the most powerful accusation. It showed she was not a jealous and blind wife, but a victim who had nearly lost her life in a cruel plot. When Eleanor finished, the courtroom was silent. The prosecutor looked at her, then turned to David Anderson. "Defendant David Anderson, do you have anything to say about Mrs. Caldwell's testimony?" David Anderson lowered his head and said nothing. At that moment, Eleanor spoke suddenly, her voice still calm. "Your Honor, may I ask the defendant, David Anderson, a question?" The judge nodded. Eleanor turned around. For the first time in the entire trial, she looked directly at the man who had been her husband. Her eyes showed no hatred, only a deep sadness. David Anderson. She called him by his name. "I only have one question. During the 6 months you gave me those infusions, was there ever a moment when you thought that the baby in my womb was your own child?" The question was not directly related to the legal facts, but it appealed directly to conscience and humanity. The entire courtroom held its breath, all eyes on David Anderson. He lifted his head and looked at Eleanor. His lips moved as if he wanted to say something, but in the end, no sound came out. He lowered his head again, his shoulders shaking. That silence was more terrifying than any confession. A week after the interrogation, the sentence was handed down. The courtroom was just as solemn, but the atmosphere was even heavier. Everyone awaited the final verdict, the final punctuation to a scandal that had shaken the entire command. Eleanor Caldwell still sat in her place, her back straight and her face calm. Today she was not there as a witness or a victim, but to witness the end. She needed an official closure to the darkest chapter of her life. The Major General presiding over the court put on his glasses, picked up the sentence, and read in a clear, emotionless voice. Based on the evidence and testimony presented, this court delivers the following sentence. All sound in the courtroom stopped. The defendant, David Anderson, guilty of the crimes of dereliction of duty, bribery, causing serious damage to the Army's assets, seriously violating military discipline, and damaging the image of the military, an accomplice in a crime of aggravated assault with organization and planning. The judge paused and continued. For all these reasons, the defendant David Anderson is sentenced to a total of 12 years in prison, permanent expulsion from the Army, and a dishonorable discharge. All illegally obtained assets will be confiscated. 12 years in prison. Expulsion. Each punishment was a hammer blow that shattered David Anderson's future, honor, and existence as an officer. He had nothing left. He stood there motionless, his eyes empty, as if his soul had left his body. The judge turned to the other defendant. The defendant, Chloe Vance, guilty of the crime of inducement to aggravated assault, with special cruelty and serious consequences, and of the crime of bribery. For all these reasons, the defendant Chloe Vance is sentenced to a total of 10 years in prison. Upon hearing the sentence, Chloe Vance let out a shrill scream, her eyes wide. She tried to get up and make a scene, but 2 police officers held her firmly. Her dream of entering high society had ended with a decade behind bars. The judge added, "Regarding the crime of bribery, the prosecutor's office is requested to investigate the role of Howard Vance, director of Vance Construction. Chloe's father would not escape either." Justice, though slow, arrives. After the criminal sentence, the civil judge spoke. Regarding the divorce petition between Mrs. Eleanor Caldwell and Mr. David Anderson, the court approves it. Regarding the custody of the common child, Harrison Anderson Caldwell, considering that Mr. David Anderson has committed acts of serious domestic violence against the mother and child and is unfit to raise a child, the court grants exclusive custody to Mrs. Eleanor Caldwell. Mr. Eleanor Caldwell, David Anderson will have no visitation rights until further court order. Regarding the marital assets, based on the agreement between the parties and the husband's gross fault, the court rules that all common assets, including real estate, vehicles, and savings, belong in their entirety to Mrs. Eleanor Caldwell as compensation for material and moral damages. Justice had been served, clear and fair. The two convicts were escorted out of the courtroom. As they passed Eleanor, David Anderson stopped for a second. He lifted his empty eyes to her. His dry lips moved as if he wanted to say something, but in the end, he couldn't form a word. Eleanor simply returned his gaze in silence. In her eyes, there was no longer hatred, only distance. From that moment on, they were two parallel lines that would never cross again. In the public gallery, Beatrice Anderson had fainted and was carried out of the room. Harrison Anderson still sat with his back straight, but he seemed to have aged 10 years. He watched silently as his son was taken away, then slowly stood up and left the courtroom through a private exit. The back of the illustrious general now looked lonely and heavy. Eleanor also stood up and left the court with her lawyer. The bright midday sun blinded her for an instant. The storm had passed. Everything was over. She did not feel the joy of victory, only an emptiness and a strange relief. The past was buried behind the courtroom doors. She thought of Harrison, waiting for her at home. Their future had just begun. A week after the trial, Dulles International Airport was crowded and noisy. People rushed past each other, each with their own story, their own destiny. In the midst of this hustle and bustle, Eleanor Caldwell seemed small but strangely calm. She was pushing a stroller where little Harrison slept peacefully, oblivious to the commotion. Beside her, her mother, Dr. Caldwell, pulled a small suitcase. They had already checked their luggage. All that was left was to go through security to officially leave the city that held both her sweetest happiness and her deepest pain. As they were heading to the boarding gate, a familiar figure appeared in the distance, walking slowly towards them. He was not wearing the imposing four-star general's uniform. Harrison Anderson was in civilian clothes, a simple gray shirt and dark pants, with no insignia, no escorts. He looked like an ordinary old man, his back slightly stooped, and his hair noticeably whiter. The severity of a commander had been replaced by the weariness and loneliness of a father, of a grandfather. Dr. Caldwell gently squeezed her daughter's hand and said discreetly, "I'm going to buy a bottle of water. You two talk." She left with the luggage, giving them space. Harrison Anderson approached and stopped in front of Eleanor. His gaze did not fall on her, but on his sleeping grandson. His eyes, once sharp as a hawk's, now held a rare tenderness and regret. A long time later, he looked up, his voice hoarse. "I'm sorry, daughter. The Anderson family is in your debt." Eleanor looked at him in silence. She saw the pain and helplessness in this proud man's eyes. She no longer felt hatred, only compassion. She shook her head, her voice soft and light. "You owe me nothing. I thank you for giving me justice." She made a clear distinction. The Anderson family owed her. David Anderson owed her. But the man in front of her did not. In the midst of the storm, he was the one who stepped forward and exposed the festering wound of his own family to restore her honor. Harrison Anderson looked at her, a glimmer of gratitude in his eyes. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out a black credit card. "This is," he hesitated, as if it was hard for him to say it. "It's a trust fund I've set up for Harrison. The password is his date of birth. Consider it a small gesture from his grandfather. When he grows up, for his studies, for his future, He will need it. He didn't dare give it directly to Eleanor. He placed it gently on the baby's blanket. It wasn't just money. It was the last connection, the only compensation he could offer his grandson. Eleanor looked at the card. She didn't refuse it. It was something Harrison deserved. On behalf of Harrison, thank you, Grandpa. Those 2 words made Harrison Anderson's eyes redden slightly. He turned to look at the flight board as if to hide his emotion. You, his voice wavered, a hesitation never before seen in him. Will you allow me to come to Boston from time to see him? Eleanor looked at the man in front of her. The power, the status, all were gone. All that was left was a grandfather who longed to see his grandson. She smiled softly, a genuine smile. He still carries the Anderson name. You are still his grandfather. That answer was more valuable than any yes. It acknowledged an undeniable blood tie, a connection that would not be severed by the sins of the previous generation. Harrison Anderson nodded, a heavy nod. Go on, it's almost time. Eleanor said nothing more. She gave him a final bow, pushed the stroller, and turned towards the boarding gate where her mother was waiting. She did not look back. Her back was straight and firm, walking decisively towards her future. Behind her, Harrison Anderson stood there, alone in the crowd, watching them walk away until they disappeared through the gate. Time in Boston passed quietly. 6 months later, the life of Eleanor Caldwell and her son was completely stabilized. With the compensation and assets from the divorce, she had no financial worries. She bought a spacious apartment near her parents' house. Having a master's degree in psychology, she decided not to return to her old, monotonous research job. She invested part of the money with a friend to open a small psychology practice, specializing in helping women with marital and personal problems. The work was not too stressful, but it brought her joy and a sense of purpose. By listening to others' stories, by helping them heal, she was also healing herself. Little Harrison grew chubby and adorable. He was a very good child who rarely cried and was very attached to his mother and grandparents. The scar of the past seemed to fade, giving way to days of peace and warmth. One autumn afternoon, with the courtyard full of golden leaves, Eleanor received a letter. The defendant, David Anderson, guilty of the crimes of dereliction of duty, bribery, causing serious damage to the Army's assets, seriously violating military discipline, and damaging the image of the military, an accomplice in a crime of aggravated assault with organization and planning. The judge paused and continued. For all these reasons, the defendant David Anderson is sentenced to a total of 12 years in prison, permanent expulsion from the Army, and a dishonorable discharge. She needed complete closure, with no strings attached. She sat by the window and opened the letter. The handwriting was strong and bold, as he used to be, but with a slight tremor. The letter was long. At first, David Anderson did not ask for forgiveness. He said he knew he had no right to. He just wanted to tell her a truth, before disappearing for the next 12 years. He wrote about their marriage. He admitted he had always envied her perfection, her rationality, her excellence, her background from a family of intellectuals. With her, he had always felt inferior, pressured. He felt that both his father and she controlled him, forcing him to live according to a perfect mold. He admitted the corruption. It was his way of seeking his own power and control. And then he wrote about the infusions. Eleanor, I can swear to God I didn't know those herbs could cause a hemorrhage. Chloe only told me they would make you feel tired, weak, and at most, you would have a slightly premature birth. I believed her. A weak and cowardly excuse. Eleanor smiled bitterly. Intentional or not, he was the one who brought her the poison every day, but the next line stunned her. You probably won't believe what I'm telling you, and you're right, because my whole life has been a lie. Eleanor, I am not the biological son of Harrison Anderson. Eleanor's hand holding the letter trembled. My mother, Beatrice Anderson, had a first love before marrying him. I am the result of that relationship. Back then, Harrison Anderson was seriously injured on the battlefield. The doctors said it was almost impossible for him to have children. To save her marriage, my mother hid the truth, but he knew. I don't know how, but he knew everything. And yet he raised me as his own son, perhaps because of the honor of a general that didn't allow him to admit he had been deceived. That's why he was always so strict with me. My mother, out of guilt, always compensated me with money and pampering behind his back. That turned me into a coward and greedy. I discovered the truth by chance, hearing her talk drunk. Since then, I have lived with an inferiority complex and fear. I tried to be excellent, to do everything possible to prove I deserved the Anderson name, but the more I tried, the more I sank into error. Eleanor finished reading. The letter fell from her hands. She sat in silence for a long time. A family tragedy perfectly hidden under a cloak of glory. She no longer felt hatred, but a strange compassion. It turned out that the monster who had shattered her life was, in turn, the flawed product of another tragedy. The betrayal, the plot, the crime, all originated from a lie decades ago. She picked up the letter, slowly went to the kitchen, and turned on the gas stove. The blue flame licked the paper, turning the words, the secrets, and the pain into ashes. The past was truly over. The blue flame devoured the letter, turning the secret and tragedy of the Anderson family into a handful of ashes carried away by the wind. Eleanor Caldwell stood by the window for a long time, watching the Boston sky turn a silvery gray. Her heart no longer held hatred. The truth revealed by David, though terrible, was like a key that undid the last knot in her soul. It turned out that everyone in this story, even the villains, were victims of a lie, a scar that had festered for decades. She no longer hated David Anderson. She only felt pity for a pathetic being destroyed by his own fate and cowardice. This liberation led her to make a decision. Days later, Eleanor left Harrison with his grandparents and took a taxi to a luxurious nursing home on the outskirts of the city. After David's arrest, Beatrice Anderson had completely collapsed. The shock left her mentally unstable, alternating between moments of lucidity and confusion. Harrison Anderson, in his grief and disappointment, had moved her from D.C. to Boston, to this facility so she could be better cared for. Eleanor walked through the manicured garden, the air fresh and calm. She found Beatrice Anderson sitting alone on a stone bench under a bougainvillea, her gaze lost. She had lost a lot of weight. Her dyed hair revealed gray streaks, and her former elegance was gone, leaving only the decay of old age and pain. Hearing footsteps, she turned. Her clouded eyes took a moment to recognize her, but in her confused perception, the image distorted. She suddenly grabbed Eleanor's hand with an expression of panic and supplication. "Chloe, you've come?" Eleanor was surprised. She had mistaken her for Chloe Vance. Beatrice, not noticing her silence, continued whispering as if afraid of being heard. "Listen to me. Don't hurt David anymore. He's not his son. He's suffered enough. I swear to you, I'll give you all the money you want, but don't tell him." She repeated nonsensical phrases, trapped in the fear and secret that had tormented her all her life. It turned out her greatest fear was not that her son would go to prison, but that his true origin would be discovered, shattering the family facade she had worked so hard to maintain. Eleanor did not pull her hand away. She just listened silently. This woman's ramblings were no longer an insult, but a late and pathetic confession. All the resentment, all the damage seemed to have been cleansed by the truth. This woman, who had threatened and humiliated her, was actually a tragic figure who had lived her entire life in fear and deceit. A cold autumn wind blew. Beatrice shivered. Eleanor took off the thin silk scarf she was wearing and gently placed it over her shoulders. "It's cold, Beatrice. You should go inside and rest." The soft voice and the familiar address seemed to bring some lucidity back to Beatrice. She looked at Eleanor, her eyes no longer terrified but empty in a frightening way. She recognized Eleanor, but immediately shook her head, murmuring, "No, go away. Don't stay here." Perhaps deep down, she knew she owed her former daughter-in-law too much. Eleanor said no more, helped her up and walked her to the main building. A nurse rushed out to meet them. "Thank you for coming to visit her, Mrs. Caldwell. She's not very stable today." Eleanor nodded. She watched as the nurse led Beatrice away, her back stooped and lonely. The scar of the past would accompany her for the rest of her life. But she, upon leaving the residence and breathing the fresh autumn air, knew that her own scar had truly healed. It would not disappear, but it would no longer hurt. It would be there as a reminder of what she had been through and the strength that helped her rise. 6 months passed like a sigh. Boston entered the first days of a bright and vibrant summer. Eleanor Caldwell's life had turned to a new, peaceful, and meaningful page. Her apartment was always full of sunshine and the laughter of her little Harrison. The boy, about to turn 1, was learning to walk, full of energy and intelligence. He was the little sun that lit up her world. She was no longer Eleanor Caldwell, the wife of the general's son. She was simply Eleanor Caldwell, mother, daughter, and psychologist. Her practice, Serenely, which she shared with a friend, was on a quiet street, not very large but warmly decorated. She didn't advertise much. Her clients came by recommendation. Therefore, those who came were people who really needed help: betrayed wives, struggling single mothers, women who had lost their way. In them, Eleanor saw a reflection of herself. She listened to them with patience and empathy. She didn't give empty advice. She used her knowledge and her own painful experiences to analyze, untangle, and help them find their inner strength. She helped them understand that divorce or a breakup is not the end, but can be a new beginning. One afternoon, her last client was a young woman with eyes swollen from crying. She had just discovered her husband was cheating on her. "Mrs. Caldwell, what do I do? Should I get a divorce? But my son is so young, I'm afraid I can't do it alone." Eleanor served her a cup of chamomile tea, her voice soft and firm. "Celia, no one can decide for you whether to divorce or not. But before you decide, ask yourself, can you be happy in a marriage without trust or respect? And is a child growing up in a loveless home truly happy?" She looked into her eyes. "Any choice will be difficult, but remember, you are not alone. The greatest strength doesn't come from the man beside you, but from yourself. Give yourself time to calm down and trust that whatever happens, you and your son will be okay." The young woman burst into tears, but this time they were tears of relief. After seeing her client off, Eleanor tidied up the office. She looked out the window at the sunset that tinged the street with gold. She felt a deep peace and satisfaction. Helping others find the light was also a way of illuminating her own path. She no longer thought about finding a new love. Maybe later, if fate willed it, she would open her heart, but for now, she didn't need it. The peace she had, the freedom to be herself, to live her own life, was what she valued most. She gathered her things and went home. It was Harrison's first birthday, and the whole family was waiting for her. As she opened the door, she heard her son's laughter and the cheerful conversation of her parents. Her father was playing with him, and the boy couldn't stop laughing. Eleanor entered, hugged her son, and kissed his chubby cheeks. "Harrison, happy birthday, my love." The boy wrapped his little arms around her. "Mama." That night, the family gathered around a small birthday cake. The candlelight reflected in Harrison's clear eyes and in Eleanor's happy gaze. After the storm, the sun always comes out. The tempest had passed, leaving a calm and clear sky. This was the life she wanted. Time flies. Autumn in Boston replaced the hot summer. Almost a year after the trial, Eleanor Caldwell received an unexpected call. It was Harrison Anderson's aide. He respectfully informed her that the general had requested early retirement and that the high command had approved it. Eleanor was not surprised. After such a hard blow, it was understandable that a proud general would choose to retire. The wound caused by his only son had probably taken all his spirit. Days later, she received a call from the general himself. His voice was no longer that of a commander, but of an elderly man, somewhat hesitant and expectant. He said he was in Boston and wanted to see his grandson. Eleanor agreed. She had no reason to refuse. All the hatred had vanished. Only the undeniable blood tie remained. That afternoon, Harrison Anderson arrived at her apartment. He came alone, in dark clothes and a bag full of expensive toys. Standing in front of the unfamiliar door, the man who once commanded thousands of soldiers seemed a little lost. Eleanor opened the door and invited him in. "Dad, you've arrived." Harrison, who was now over a year old, was toddling around the living room. Seeing the stranger, he stopped, his big black eyes looking at him with curiosity. Harrison Anderson froze when he saw his grandson. It was the first time he had seen him up close since he was born. He looked a lot like Eleanor, especially his clear, intelligent eyes. But the stubborn chin and high forehead had an air of the Andersons. He slowly bent down, trying to get on his level. He offered him a toy tank. His voice, accustomed to giving orders, was now clumsy and surprisingly tender. "Harrison, come to Grandpa." Harrison was not afraid. He wobbled over, not for the toy, but as if drawn to the old man's white hair and wrinkles. He extended his chubby little hand and touched the general's gnarled, calloused hand. In that moment, the old soldier's iron heart seemed to melt. He lifted his grandson. A soft, warm, heavy sensation filled his arms. It was different from holding a weapon or a pen. It was the continuation of life, his own blood. Tears welled up in his old eyes. Eleanor watched silently from a distance. She went to the kitchen to make tea. When she returned, Harrison Anderson was playing with Harrison on the floor, patiently teaching him how to assemble the toys. The image of an illustrious general sitting on the floor playing with children's toys was unimaginable but incredibly real and touching. After a while, Harrison got tired and fell asleep in his grandfather's arms. Harrison Anderson carefully laid him in the crib. He sat on the sofa, drinking the tea Eleanor had served him, not taking his eyes off his grandson. "He's a very good boy." Eleanor nodded. "Yes, he rarely cries." Silence settled again. After a moment, Harrison Anderson spoke, his voice deeper. "Thank you, daughter." Eleanor was surprised. "For what?" "Thank you for letting him keep the Anderson name." It turned out that was what worried him most. For a man who valued family and lineage so much, this was the greatest comfort. Eleanor looked at him and said calmly, "The past is ours. The future is Harrison's. I don't want him to grow up with hatred or to deny his roots. After all, half of the Anderson family's blood runs through his veins." Her words stunned him. He looked at his former daughter-in-law, the woman he once considered weak, and now saw her immense generosity and rationality. Beatrice Anderson, David Anderson, and he himself, they all owed her too much. He stood up to leave. "I won't bother you anymore." Eleanor walked him to the door. Before leaving, he turned to look at her one last time. "Eleanor, live well." It was not an order but a sincere blessing. Winter came quickly to Boston, bringing cold winds. But no matter how harsh the weather, in Eleanor Caldwell's heart, there was always a small, warm Sunday. One winter afternoon, Eleanor left work early to pick up Harrison from daycare. She saw him through the fence, playing on the slide with his friends. He was wearing a yellow snowsuit. He looked like an adorable cotton ball. His crystal-clear laughter echoed, chasing away the cold. When the bell rang, Harrison was the first to run out. Seeing his mother, he shouted, "Mama!" and threw himself into her arms. She hugged him, inhaling the sweet scent of his hair. All the day's fatigue vanished. As they were preparing to leave, a warm male voice sounded behind them. "Mrs. Caldwell, finished for the day?" Eleanor turned around. It was Dr. Bosch, a colleague from her practice, a good psychologist, a widower for a few years, kind and polite. He had a young daughter in the same class as Harrison. Lately, he had hinted several times at his interest in getting to know her better. Eleanor smiled politely. "Yes, Dr. Bosch. Are you picking up little Clara too?" Dr. Bosch nodded, looking at her sympathetically. "Yes. This weekend there's a special screening of The Lion King. My Clara loves it. I was wondering if you and Harrison would be interested in coming along so the kids can play together." It was clearly an invitation to a date. It was subtle, using the children as an excuse. A good man, a suitable situation, an opportunity to start over. Perhaps another woman would have accepted, but Eleanor simply smiled. A sincere smile, but with a touch of distance. "Thank you for the invitation, Dr. Bosch, but this weekend I already have plans with my parents. It will have to be another time." A polite but firm refusal. Dr. Bosch, being intelligent, understood. He didn't seem disappointed, just nodded with a smile. "Ah, what a shame. Well, maybe another time." He left with his daughter. Eleanor took Harrison's little hand. The boy looked up at her and asked, "Mommy, why aren't we going to the movies with Clara?" Eleanor bent down and kissed his forehead. Because this weekend, Mommy wants to spend all her time with her son. We'll go to the park and get ice cream, okay? Harrison shouted with joy. Yay! Mother and son walked hand in hand under the pale winter afternoon Sunday. The wind blew cold, but their hands were joined, giving each other warmth. The future was long. Maybe one day she would meet another man, someone who truly valued and loved her. Or maybe not. But it no longer mattered. She once thought that happiness was finding a pillar to lean on, but after the storm, she realized that the strongest pillar was herself. She didn't need to depend on anyone to find the light, because she was her own sun, and her son's Sunday